It started with hope, not optimism, but something thinner. Hope pulled taut like thread. By 9 a.m., less than 2 hours after Ethan Wilder vanished from the sidewalk near his home, the quiet residential grid of Maple Ridge was no longer quiet. Law enforcement had already cordoned off the block. A K-9 unit from the next county was brought in. By noon, there were over 40 volunteers walking shoulder to shoulder through the woods that bordered the far end of the neighborhood. Parents clutched flashlights in one hand and printouts of Ethan's school photo in the other. The air felt colder than it had that morning. People whispered like something sacred had been violated. In a way, it had. Childhood safety, the illusion of it, was ruptured in one morning, and the town didn't know how to hold itself together. Helicopters traced slow circles overhead, scanning the flat land that stretched into dormant cornfields. A nearby reservoir was searched, drainage grates opened, trash bins checked. Every step, every effort, every organized sweep brought nothing. No shoes, no snack wrapper, no child. By evening, the search had grown to over 100 people. Jessica stayed back at the house, half sedated, surrounded by officers asking the same questions over and over again. What was he wearing? Did he say anything strange? Did you see anyone near the stop? One neighbor, Timothy Dorsey, a retired mail carrier who jogged the same route every morning, reported something odd. A white sedan, parked on the shoulder, engine idling. He didn't see anyone inside, just caught it in his peripheral as he passed, but the time matched. It was between 7:30 and 7:40 a.m., right when Ethan would have been standing there. The detail sent a wave of anxiety through the police, who immediately put out a request for anyone with home security footage. A few homes had systems, but none pointed toward the road. One image, blurred, distant, seemed to show a light-colored vehicle pulling away from the intersection around the same time. That was all they had. As hours turned into days, suspicion infected the town. It started subtly. A sideways glance, a hesitant hello. Then it grew. Parents stopped letting their kids walk alone. Facebook groups exploded with finger-pointing theories. One post suggested a man 2 streets over, who hadn't attended any searches, was hiding something. Another thread dug up a local resident's decades-old arrest for indecent exposure and demanded he be investigated. Then someone mentioned Jessica's ex-husband, Tyler Wilder. He hadn't been around in years. Some even forgot Ethan had a father. Now, suddenly, people wondered if he'd come back into town. Tyler was questioned, of course. He'd been in another state that day, proven by work logs and surveillance footage. But that didn't stop the rumors. Maple Ridge, once tightly knit, began to unravel. Neighbors no longer spoke over fences. Some who had joined the early search stopped coming. Fear had calcified into distrust. Doors stayed locked even during the day. Some families moved. Others installed cameras, floodlights, and alarms. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about the creeping sense that safety had always been a mirage. And in the center of it all was Jessica. She barely spoke. She didn't return calls. She refused interviews. She stayed in Ethan's room, which still smelled like cinnamon shampoo and pencil shavings. She left his toys untouched. She kept his dinosaur backpack, the one he was supposed to wear that day, on the kitchen table, refusing to believe the worst. But the backpack, the one thing he always carried, was never recovered. Police considered it a key piece of evidence. Whoever had Ethan likely had that bag, too. That thought haunted her. By the end of that first week, the town had exhausted its resources. The search narrowed to targeted efforts, mostly by officers and volunteers who couldn't walk away yet. But the collective energy, the massive, hopeful push, was gone. In its place, quiet. An eerie, guilt-ridden silence where everyone wondered if they'd missed something. If someone among them had watched Ethan that morning and said nothing. Or worse, done something. And with every passing day, that white sedan became less of a clue and more of a ghost, slipping further into memory, leaving only a question. Who had been sitting in that car? And where had they gone? By the start of 2012, the posters that once covered every storefront and telephone pole in Maple Ridge were peeling at the edges, washed out by sun and rain. The Amber Alert was long canceled. The nightly updates had stopped, and the town, which once held its breath together, slowly exhaled and moved on. The momentum that carried the early days of the search had fizzled into quiet, unresolved grief. People stopped talking about Ethan Wilder, at least in public, but for Jessica, time had not passed at all. She still parked in the same grocery lot where she and Ethan used to shop. She still avoided driving past the bus stop. His sneakers stayed by the front door for months. No one touched them. The search effort officially scaled down by spring. Donations meant to fund private investigators and rescue teams dried up after the one-year mark. Volunteers were exhausted, emotionally spent, or simply defeated. The local news station aired a brief anniversary segment, Ethan's face beside a faded timeline, but the phone lines stayed silent. No new tips, no sightings, no witnesses coming forward. Ethan had vanished completely. His name began to fade from headlines and conversations, except for one place: his mother's phone. Jessica refused to change her voicemail. It still played Ethan's voice from 2 months before he disappeared. A silly message recorded by accident. "Hi, this is Ethan's mom. Leave a message, or maybe I'll call you back." It was scratchy, childlike, and unmistakably him. Jessica kept it as a tether, like proof he had existed in a world that now felt allergic to remembering him. Every time she checked her messages, she listened to that greeting first. It became a ritual, equal parts comfort and punishment. Her marriage didn't survive the second year. Tyler had tried to stay present, supportive, but grief expressed itself differently in both of them. He blamed himself, quietly but relentlessly. Jessica, meanwhile, could hardly speak without crying. They fought about bills, about press conferences, about what they would say if Ethan came home. Eventually, they stopped talking at all. Tyler moved to Illinois. Jessica stayed in Iowa, clinging to the house for as long as she could, even after the bedroom grew dusty and cold. When foreclosure threatened in late 2013, she finally left. A smaller apartment, fewer windows, no yard. By then, the lead detective assigned to Ethan's case had been moved to another department. Budget cuts, they said. A younger officer took over, briefly, before it was classified inactive. Not closed, but not active either. Just there, a file on a shelf with a post-it note that read, "No new movement." Jessica called the station every week, every Tuesday. Always the same question. "Anything new?" And always the same answer. "No, ma'am, nothing yet." Over time, her voice got quieter. The calls are shorter. But she never missed a Tuesday. The winter of that same year, a candlelight vigil was held on the anniversary of his disappearance. Unlike the first vigil, which had drawn TV crews and reporters, this one had no coverage, no press. Only 12 people came, mostly close friends and one neighbor who had always left his porch light on for Ethan. They lit candles, said his name, but no one knew what else to say anymore. There was no script for year 3 of a missing child, only silence. In the absence of updates, the family received digital renderings from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, an age progression image of what Ethan might look like at 10, then 11. The photos didn't look like him to Jessica, too sharp around the nose, the hairs too neat. Still, she printed them, framed them, placed them beside the last real photo she had. Ethan in a Halloween costume, dressed as a robot made of cardboard and duct tape. Behind the scenes, the case didn't officially close, but law enforcement's interest had cooled. The reward remained posted, but leads had stopped entirely. Tips from psychics, unverified sightings, dreams. Those were the only messages left in the inbox. For most, the case was now just an unresolved tragedy, a name from a sad time. But for Jessica, the silence didn't mean peace. It meant something worse. That maybe the world had accepted Ethan was gone. Maybe they had all given up. Everyone but her. In January of 2017, a man named Reed Sloan sat across from federal agents in a Michigan correctional facility and started talking. What began as a cryptic offhand mention of regret turned into something else entirely. Over the course of several interviews, Reed detailed a pattern of kidnappings he claimed to have committed throughout the Midwest between 2008 and 2014. His stories were graphic, disturbingly specific, and frighteningly plausible. Some of them matched unsolved disappearances, others didn't. But when Reed described taking a boy in Iowa from near a mailbox where semis passed every 10 minutes, agents took notice. One of them typed 3 words into a cold case database: Iowa, child, mailbox. The Ethan Wilder file came up almost immediately. Within days, the Iowa Bureau of Investigation reopened the Wilder case file. Photos of Ethan, maps of his neighborhood, and autopsy reports from nearby cases were spread out in a temporary war room. Reed had no reason to lie. He was already serving consecutive life sentences. But the details were off, subtle things. He claimed the boy had dark brown eyes. Ethan's were hazel with a green fleck in the left. He said it happened at night. Ethan disappeared in daylight. Still, the image of a mailbox on a rural road lined with trucks matched eerily well. Jessica was notified. It was the first time in 4 years she'd received a call about Ethan that wasn't from a psychic or a journalist. She sat down on her couch and listened in silence. When the detective told her a man might know something about her son, she didn't breathe for almost a minute. Hope arrived, as it always had, without warning and without mercy. Within 48 hours, the press got wind of the story. A serial offender had mentioned Ethan's name. That alone was enough to revive media attention. News trucks returned to Maple Ridge for the first time in years. Satellite dishes bloomed on front lawns. Reporters knocked on Jessica's door again, only this time they were more careful, more cautious. She didn't open it. She stayed inside and waited for the phone to ring. Investigators flew to Michigan to interrogate Reed further. Under pressure, he backpedaled. He said maybe it wasn't Iowa, maybe it was Indiana or Kansas. The names blurred in his mind, he claimed. When pressed on the date, he insisted it happened in 2011. But jail records proved otherwise. Reed had been behind bars for a parole violation in October of that year, locked up just 5 days before Ethan disappeared. The timeline didn't work. Agents knew it. So did Jessica. But still, something in her refused to let go. She'd already imagined Ethan alive in 100 different scenarios. Adding one more to the pile didn't make it worse. It just made it heavier. For a moment, Ethan wasn't missing. He was just waiting. In a room somewhere, maybe scared, maybe older, maybe already beyond saving. But real. That was the trap of hope. It came dressed like truth. Eventually, Reed was ruled out as a suspect in Ethan's case. The evidence simply didn't align. But in the EA's process of investigating his claims, agents reopened several dormant leads. One of them was the white sedan seen idling near the bus stop in 2011. The car had been entered into the case file early on, but never traced to an owner. Investigators attempted to rerun the plates based on grainy security footage collected from nearby intersections, hoping improved AI tools could render more accurate results. But nothing surfaced. No hits. No registration matches. Whoever had been in that vehicle was still anonymous. Jessica watched it unfold from the sidelines. She agreed to one interview with a Des Moines newspaper, a brief quote printed beneath a recent rendering of Ethan at age 14. "I'll keep answering the phone," she said. "Even if it's not him, I have to know." The quote circled online briefly, shared by missing persons forums and amateur sleuths. But by March, interest had died down again. Reed Sloan was old news. So was Ethan. For most of the world, it had been 6 years since the boy vanished. For Jessica, it was still October 17th. Time moved differently for mothers with missing children. It didn't move at all. In August of 2019, a Reddit post titled, "Who is this boy from Kansas?" appeared on a thread dedicated to cold cases. The grainy still came from a security camera mounted high above a gas station parking lot off Interstate 70. It was time-stamped 3 weeks earlier. The boy in the image was lean, wearing a loose hoodie despite the summer heat, and walking behind a truck that blocked most of his face. But one detail, enhanced in a follow-up post, stood out: his eyes. Or rather, the slight difference in color between them, one darker, one hazel green, a rare trait, one that had always marked Ethan Wilder. The image spread fast. Within 48 hours, it was reposted across multiple platforms, shared by armchair detectives, cold case enthusiasts, and strangers who had followed Ethan's story years ago and never quite let go. Jessica was tagged in a comment, then a direct message, then a call from a woman she hadn't spoken to in years. The second she saw the photo, she dropped her phone. Her hands were shaking. The resolution was poor, but the outline was familiar. The stance, the way the boy's shoulder dipped to one side. She was convinced. It had to be him. Within 2 days, Jessica was on a flight to Kansas. She hadn't been on a plane in nearly a decade. She hadn't been out of Iowa in years. But none of that mattered. She carried with her the original age-progressed renderings, old-school photos, a laminated missing person flyer, and a printout of the Reddit image. When she arrived, she went straight to the truck stop, holding up the photo to every employee, every driver, every drifter willing to look. Some stared blankly. Others nodded sympathetically. But no one recognized the boy. By the time she met with local law enforcement, the trail had already cooled. The original surveillance footage had been overwritten. Standard policy after 30 days. The only copy was the blurry screenshot from Reddit, and no one could confirm who had first posted it. Still, for weeks, online communities continued dissecting the image. Some claimed the boy's jawline was too square. Others swore the shoes he wore matched a pair sold only after 2013, making it impossible for them to be Ethan's. But a few pointed out something more subtle, a nervous tic. The boy seemed to be scratching his forearm compulsively in 3 consecutive stills, a habit Ethan had when he was anxious. Jessica latched onto that. She spent hours watching those frames over and over, whispering to herself, "That's him." Kansas police followed up on truck logs, interviewed clerks, and even traced a license plate from a parked semi visible in the frame. But the driver didn't remember seeing a teenage boy. No missing persons matched the image. No runaway reports led anywhere. Without a name, without a clearer photo, the boy from Kansas disappeared back into digital noise. Just another ghost in the system. The excitement, the possibility, faded almost as quickly as it came. Jessica stayed in Kansas longer than she planned. She rented a motel room near the truck stop and returned there every day for nearly a week. Just watching. Hoping. Sometimes staring at strangers' faces too long. She began handing out copies of the image herself. One woman accepted it, studied it, and softly said, "I hope you find him." Jessica didn't respond. She just nodded, folded the extra copy, and walked back to her car. When she returned to Iowa, she didn't speak to anyone for days. Friends left voicemails. Her sister stopped by. But Jessica shut down. She started writing again. Letters to Ethan, long ones, honest ones. Pages of what she'd seen, how she felt, how angry she was at everything. The world, the system, herself. The letters filled a drawer beside her bed. None were mailed. It all ended the same way. "Where are you, my baby?" A question she'd asked 1,000 different ways over 8 years, but never answered. The online thread slowly died. The original poster never reappeared. Some speculated it had been a hoax, a cruel troll fishing for attention. Others held on to hope, thinking maybe the boy was still out there, just afraid to speak, waiting for someone to recognize him. Jessica never confirmed either belief. She just watched her son age in her mind, one missing year at a time, as the world kept offering glimpses of maybe, and then taking them away. It started like hundreds of other forgotten storage units across the Midwest, abandoned, unpaid, and ready for auction. In January 2023, a facility just outside Des Moines posted a notice for a defaulted locker. Contents unknown, no registered activity since 2019. Within days, the unit was sold for $83 to a part-time reseller who ran a modest YouTube channel, documenting finds from estate sales and auction bins. He wasn't expecting anything valuable. At most, he thought, maybe some old tools or camping gear. What he found instead would crack open a case that had been dormant for over a decade and shatter what little peace remained for those still holding on. The locker was rusted around the edges, the door screeching open after 3 kicks. Inside, the space was cluttered but ordinary. A few plastic bins, a folding table, worn tarps, cracked coolers. The kind of detritus people store when they're moving or can't bring themselves to throw things away. The reseller filmed everything, narrating casually, rifling through boxes filled with VHS tapes, outdated electronics, and yellowed manuals. And then, near the back wall, partially hidden under a rotted duffel bag, he saw it. A large, dust-covered metal trunk, heavy, padlocked, dented at the corners. He thought maybe it held collectibles or tools, something worth salvaging. But when he finally cracked the lock, everything changed. The smell hit first, not rot but age, damp metal and mildew. Inside, several items were wrapped tightly in old dish towels and rags. The first bundle contained a pair of small sneakers, heavily worn, the soles nearly peeled. The next item was a child's backpack, dinosaurs printed on the fabric, faded but unmistakable. Inside, pencils, a broken plastic ruler, a half-used eraser. Then came the red hoodie, folded neatly, almost reverently. The reseller stopped talking, his camera, still running, lowered to the ground before cutting off completely. He stepped outside and called the police. By the time authorities arrived, the unit had been taped off. Officers logged each item, photographing them one by one. A tag in the hoodie still bore a name, barely legible: E. Wilder. Detectives froze. Some had been new recruits when the original case broke in 2011. Others had only read about it in training. But the name stirred something. The next morning, the unit's ownership history was pulled. The rental had been in the name of Walter Driggs, a man who died quietly in his home in 2021 from what was ruled natural causes. No next of kin, no known family. Driggs had been a delivery driver for a regional courier service in Iowa from 1998 until his retirement in 2015. He had no criminal record, no prior complaints, just a solitary man with an average life, at least on paper. But the timing lined up. Records showed he'd been assigned deliveries in the Maple Ridge area between 2010 and 2012. One traffic citation from that year placed him on a street just 2 blocks from the Wilder home, on the exact morning Ethan disappeared. Investigators returned to the storage unit with forensics teams. They combed through every inch. In a crate beneath the trunk, they discovered an envelope containing several photographs, most of them unremarkable. Nature scenes, buildings, old trucks. But one photo showed a child's shadow on a wall. You couldn't see his face, but the shoes, the stance, the timestamp. Everything pointed in one direction. The news reached Jessica through the detective she still called every Tuesday. He didn't give details over the phone, just asked if she could come in. She arrived the same day, sat silently as they showed her the items. Her knees buckled at the backpack. The hoodie made her cover her face. She didn't speak for nearly an hour. Eventually, she whispered, "That's his." That's all he did. It was the first physical evidence of Ethan in over 11 years. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Reporters revisited the case with a sense of disbelief. A random storage auction, a YouTuber, a man no one had ever suspected. It didn't feel real. And yet, every piece fits. Still, one question loomed. If Walter Driggs was responsible, where had Ethan gone? And why had no one ever noticed anything strange about him? Investigators would dig into that next. But for now, they had a name, a storage unit, and the belongings of a child who vanished without a sound. For a man whose name had never once surfaced during the original investigation, Walter Driggs suddenly became the center of a decades-old mystery. On paper, he was no one special. A retired delivery driver, lived alone, died alone, no wife, no kids, just a 64-year-old man who passed quietly in his sleep in late 2021, leaving behind little more than a few scattered belongings in a forgotten storage unit. But in the wake of that unit's discovery, of the backpack, the hoodie, the child's sneakers, law enforcement knew they had to peel back every layer of his past. Because something about Walter Driggs didn't add up. Not anymore. Public records were the first stop. Nothing serious popped. A few minor traffic violations, one for speeding, another for rolling through a stop sign. But one citation, buried deep in the county's archives, caught a detective's eye. It was dated October 17, 2011, the day Ethan Wilder vanished. The violation? Failure to yield near a crosswalk. The address? 1 block south of the Wilder residence. The timestamp? 7:42 a.m., roughly the same time Ethan was last seen standing at his bus stop. That detail had never been flagged before. Back then, Driggs was just one of thousands of drivers moving through that neighborhood every morning. But now it was evidence. Quiet, chilling, and damning. As investigators retraced Driggs's work history, a pattern emerged. He had worked delivery routes in the area for over a decade. He knew the streets, the schedules. He would have known where the children waited for their buses, which parents stood outside and which didn't. He would have had reason to idle unnoticed, just another man in a uniform. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would make a neighbor look twice. Former co-workers interviewed by detectives described him as odd, but never threatening. He rarely spoke, kept to himself. I ate lunch alone. One former supervisor said he always seemed to be mentally somewhere else. Another remembered he kept notebooks in his glove box and wrote in them during breaks. But no one ever asked what he was writing. After his death, Driggs's small rental home was cleared out by a property manager. Most of his belongings had been discarded or donated, but the house's original owner had kept a set of keys to the attic crawl space. Investigators obtained a warrant and entered it in late March. Inside, they found more notebooks, dozens, bound in cracked leather and duct tape, pages upon pages of cramped handwriting. What started as lists, license plates, dates, names, turned into something else. Fantasies, scenarios. Some are violent, others are disturbingly mundane. One entry described a boy in a red hoodie by the mailbox. Another, dated 2 days after Ethan's disappearance, simply read, "He's quieter now. Sleep most of the day." The contents of the journals were deeply unsettling, but also inconsistent. Some entries appeared delusional, veering into fragmented, incoherent language. Others were painfully lucid. Experts were brought in to analyze them. A forensic linguist concluded that while some passages could be fictional, others were likely autobiographical. The guilt that saturated the later entries couldn't be ignored. One note, scribbled on a torn grocery receipt, read, "No one asked, no one knocked, no one ever saw me." Another, "I never planned it." I just couldn't stop. Further digging revealed a strange pattern with his storage units. Over the span of 20 years, Driggs had rented 7 of them, most under his own name, a few under aliases. All were scattered around Iowa. Most had been emptied by the time police searched them. But one stood out, the unit in Des Moines. The only one he kept paid and locked even after retirement, the only one with items directly tied to Ethan. Why just that unit? Why preserve those particular belongings for over a decade? It wasn't just a crime scene. It was a shrine. Quiet, hidden, methodical. What remained unclear was the motive. Driggs never left a confession, no will, no final letter. His digital footprint was minimal. No social media, no forum activity, nothing that pointed toward an ideology or online influence. He didn't fit the profile of a repeat offender, or maybe he did, and no one had ever connected the dots. Cold cases from nearby counties were re-examined, one missing child from Nebraska, another from rural Missouri. But no direct links were found. Just questions. More silence. Still, with each passing day, the picture became harder to ignore. A man whose life passed in the margins had been hiding in plain sight. And now, the question shifted from who took Ethan to how many others might have been missed. Investigators weren't ready to say it out loud yet, but the evidence told its own story. Walter Driggs hadn't just stolen a child. He'd kept the secret so well for so long that even death almost buried it forever. The metal trunk, already cataloged and photographed, had been moved to a secure forensic lab just outside Des Moines. What investigators initially believed was a grim but straightforward recovery of personal belongings, Ethan's backpack, the hoodie, the sneakers, turned out to conceal something far more disturbing. It wasn't immediately visible. Only when technicians began dismantling the false bottom of the trunk, checking for hidden compartments or additional evidence, did they find it. Wedged into the lining, wrapped in a sheet of waxed cloth, was a small fragment of human jawbone, intact enough to reveal 2 molars, one of them chipped. It was unmistakably human, and it didn't belong in a storage locker. The chain of custody was initiated instantly. Samples were rushed to the state lab, and 2 days later, the confirmation came back. It was Ethan. The DNA matched the cheek swab Jessica had given 11 years earlier. The room went quiet when the result came in. There was no announcement, no press conference, just a slow collective realization that the worst fear had finally been proven. The search was over. Ethan Wilder wasn't missing anymore. He was dead. Forensics began a deeper analysis of the bone. It hadn't been left in the trunk to decay naturally. The surface was unnaturally clean. Microscopic grooves and residue suggested it had been scrubbed, chemically even, and the dirt still embedded in the pores was not from the storage unit. Soil composition analysis indicated it came from soft, nutrient-rich earth, likely a flower bed or private yard. That detail shifted the theory. Investigators now believed Ethan had been buried at some point after his death, then later exhumed. The question was, why? And more disturbingly, when? Luminol testing revealed trace blood residue on one of the trunk's interior corners. Old, too degraded for usable DNA, but consistent with a long-term transport scenario. Beneath the trunk's liner, a strip of masking tape was found, barely clinging to the surface. Written on it in faded ink, 9, quiet now. The meaning wasn't clear. Some believed it was a reference to Ethan's age. Others thought it marked a day, a stage, a command. Regardless, the implication was undeniable. Driggs had kept Ethan alive for an unknown period before he died. Not hours, not minutes, days, possibly weeks. Autopsy from a single bone couldn't determine cause of death. No blunt trauma, no obvious breaks. No other remains were recovered, despite extensive searches around all properties once connected to Walter Driggs. Canine teams swept multiple sites, including parks and abandoned parcels near his former delivery route. Nothing. Just one bone. A single jawbone, scrubbed clean and hidden away like a sick memorial. Enough to confirm a death, but not enough to explain it. Detectives debated what to release publicly. The discovery would eventually be announced, but the details, the bone, the burial, the possibility of captivity, were held back. They weren't ready for the media storm. More importantly, they weren't ready to tell Jessica. Not all of it. Not yet. She was brought into the station on a Tuesday, same time as always, same hallway. But this time, the detective didn't let her ask the usual question. He sat her down. Quietly, carefully. He explained that part of Ethan had been found, that the DNA was conclusive, that he was gone. Jessica didn't speak for a long time, just looked at the floor. When she finally asked if they knew what had happened, he said, "We're still working on it." That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. What they had uncovered was too much to explain in a single conversation, and too horrifying to speak out loud. Jessica left the station without a press statement. She didn't stand in front of cameras. She didn't hold a photo. She just went home and sat in Ethan's room, untouched since the move. She placed the last age progression photo face down in the drawer and opened the shoebox filled with the letters she'd written to him over the years. She added one more, shorter this time. Only 2 words. "I know." She folded it, sealed it, and placed it on top. But for everyone else, investigators, neighbors, the cold case unit, the discovery only deepened the mystery. Why had Driggs kept part of Ethan's remains and discarded the rest? Why clean it? Why hide it in a locked trunk and pay for its storage every month until he dies? There were no answers in the journals, no confession, just silence. And in that silence, the timeline shifted from tragic to monstrous. Because now it wasn't just about a boy who vanished. It was about how long he had been hidden, and how close he had been to being found, if only someone had looked just a little harder. Jessica didn't speak to the media. She didn't return phone calls from reporters, didn't answer emails from documentary producers or cold case podcasts hoping for an exclusive. In the weeks following the confirmation of Ethan's remains, she shut out the world entirely. She met with the coroner. She signed the final documents. She held a private burial attended by fewer than 15 people, just family, 2 close friends, and a former neighbor who still mowed the small strip of grass behind her apartment building. There were no photographers, no live streams, no press, just a mother and a closed casket, smaller than it should have been, lowered into the earth on a cold spring morning. Back in Maple Ridge, the news traveled fast but quiet. There were no sirens, no vigils this time, just silence. The same neighborhood that had once filled fields and forests with search parties now watched from behind curtains. Some people whispered about what had been missed. Others spoke more directly, asking how a man like Walter Driggs could have lived among them unnoticed. The question wasn't just rhetorical. It had weight. It lingered in grocery store lines, school, board meetings, and late-night walks past empty driveways. It was the kind of guilt that didn't scream. It just sat there. The town council convened a special meeting. Nothing dramatic, no camera crews or political speeches. But by the end of it, 2 proposals had been drafted. One focused on mandatory background checks for long-term storage unit renters. The other was more complex, an initiative to create new statewide guidelines for cold case procedures involving missing children, especially in situations where evidence had been limited or mishandled. The vote passed unanimously. But legislation didn't bring Ethan back. It didn't explain how the clues had been missed. It didn't explain why a traffic citation sitting in a forgotten drawer hadn't raised flags 12 years earlier, or why no one thought to question a man who quietly paid for a locked unit even years after retirement. Walter Driggs's estate, what little there was frozen under civil action. Jessica's lawyer filed a wrongful death suit, not for financial restitution, but to gain access to everything Driggs had owned or written. She wanted every journal, every photograph, every receipt. It wasn't about understanding. It was about reclaiming space, about clawing back even the smallest sliver of her son's story from the man who had stolen it. Some neighbors organized a fundraiser for a small memorial. No statue, nothing grand, just a bronze plaque, the size of a notebook, embedded into the sidewalk near the corner of Maple and Ridgeview, the corner where Ethan had stood, waiting that morning in 2011. It was installed without ceremony. It didn't name the killer. It didn't mention what happened. It didn't need to. It said only 4 words. He was here. Ethan. The school bus stop was relocated within a week. Not far, just 2 blocks over. A new intersection, a new routine, new children. Most of them didn't know Ethan's name. Their parents did, but even they stopped bringing it up. It wasn't denial, it was exhaustion, the kind that comes from knowing the truth too late. And for many, that truth had become unbearable. Jessica stayed. She didn't move out of state. She didn't go back to the old house. She stayed in the small apartment on the edge of town, working nights at a local bookstore, speaking to almost no one. She rarely walked past the plaque. If she needed to, she crossed the street. But every Tuesday, she still called the detective's office, not to ask for updates, there were none left, but to say thank you. The words were simple. She didn't elaborate, she just needed to speak them into the line. For years, those calls had been about hope. Now they were about grief, the kind that needed a place to go. In time, the case slipped from headlines again. Other stories replaced it. Other children disappeared. Other storage units were opened. But in Maple Ridge, the silence that followed Ethan's burial wasn't just mourning. It was a shadow. It followed people down sidewalks and into quiet kitchens and out of church pews. It asked questions they didn't want answered, questions about how close danger had been, how easily evil had hidden behind ordinary doors, and how sometimes the worst truths aren't buried in the woods, but kept just a few feet away, under lock and key, waiting to be found. It wasn't over. Not yet. Months after the trunk was recovered from the storage unit, long after the plaque was bolted into the sidewalk and Ethan's belongings were sealed in evidence lockers, another call came in. This one came from the new owner of Walter Driggs's former home. They were doing renovations, clearing out the crawl space beneath the floorboards in the back bedroom when they noticed something strange. The plywood beneath the insulation felt hollow, loose, and when they pulled it up, they found a false floor. Tucked beneath it was a second container, a plastic storage bin, tightly taped and sealed shut with a layer of dust so thick it had likely been untouched for over a decade. They didn't open it. They called the police. Detectives arrived within the hour. The home was evacuated. Evidence markers were placed. The bin was taken under seal to the lab. Inside were items far more personal, far more intimate than what had been found in the storage locker. Dozens of small, handwritten notebooks, pages filled with obsessive, chaotic script, loose photographs, a broken analog camera, and a single unmarked envelope with the words, "Do not view," written in block letters. Inside it was a VHS tape. On the label, one name and one year. Ethan, 2011. The detectives who had been on the case since the beginning, who had combed fields and watched Jessica cry through interviews and followed dead leads into nowhere, stood in silence. They didn't need to speculate. They already knew what the tape likely contained. A search warrant was expedited to authorize viewing. The tape was transferred to digital and watched in a secure federal facility. Only a handful of people would ever see it. What they witnessed confirmed everything they feared. The details were never released to the public. What was shown on that tape was deemed too damaging, too graphic, too painful to disclose. But what officials did confirm was that it contained footage of Ethan alive, awake, frightened, and visibly injured. He had been held in the basement of Walter's home for 11 days. His movements were restricted. His appearance changed as the days passed. The setting was sparse, a mattress on concrete, a single overhead bulb, a calendar with the days marked in red. They watched it all, and then they watched the end. Ethan's final moments were documented. There was no ambiguity, no lingering possibility of escape, no accident to question. The cause of death was clear, so clear that the medical examiner needed only stills to close the file. The report was completed, then sealed. Out of respect for Ethan, for Jessica, and perhaps for the public who would never be able to unsee it. When Jessica was told, she didn't ask to view the tape. She didn't ask for a description. She only wanted one answer. Was he alone? The answer was yes. Walter had acted alone. No evidence pointed to an accomplice, no presence of other voices or visitors. It didn't ease the pain, but it narrowed the story. It gave it a beginning, middle, and end. That was more than most families ever got. The investigation was formally closed 2 weeks later. Driggs was named the sole perpetrator. All remaining evidence, including the tape, was locked under federal seal. No leaks, no headlines, just quiet. Even the forums that had followed the case for years stopped posting. The speculation was over. The truth had landed like concrete. Jessica didn't speak publicly. She didn't need to. She'd said everything she could years earlier when no one was listening. In a final letter, one never published or shared, she wrote that the truth didn't set her free. It only gave shape to the pain. A boundary, a final line that could no longer be crossed. She never called the detective's office again. She never returned to the site of the bus stop. The plaque stayed, but she never visited it. For everyone else, the investigators, the neighbors, even strangers who had once joined search parties in open fields, there was closure, but no comfort. The boy in the photo, the missing child on flyers, the face that had aged year after year in digital renderings had finally been found, and what he endured had been seen, witnessed, documented. Some truths are too much to speak aloud, but the tape existed, and it ended all doubt.